Was a king truly born to rule, or merely to be swept away by the tides of ambition and blood? Did a crown, forged in the fires of ancient claims, ever truly belong to the man who wore it, or was it merely a gilded cage, a symbol of a destiny already written in the stars? Edward III, they called him, a name that tasted of victory and whispered of rebellion. But what lay beneath the velvet and the jewels? Let's dive into the chaos, shall we? The year was 1327. Edward, barely 21, had inherited a kingdom fractured by the ghost of his father, Edward II. A king known for his, shall we say, unique affections had left behind a nation weary of power, a treasury depleted, and a nobility simmering with resentment. Edward III, however, wasn't built for timidity. He was a whirlwind of youthful energy, a gambler with a penchant for tournaments and a disconcerting habit of befriending the wealthiest, most fiercely independent knights in the land. Imagine a scene, a vast muddy field, the air thick with the scent of horses and sweat. Knights in gleaming armor clash in a glorious, brutal dance, a tournament. Edward, astride a magnificent warhorse, is not just participating, he's involved. He's swapping boasts with the Earl of Salisbury, exchanging gifts with the powerful Baron of Cornwall, and generally cultivating an image as a man of the people, a warrior king who understood the language of steel and coin. This wasn't mere showmanship. It was a calculated move, a deliberate attempt to build alliances to solidify his position against the entrenched power of the old guard. The whispers started almost immediately. Edward I, his grandfather, had been a different beast entirely. A man obsessed with control, he treated the nobility with a chilling mixture of suspicion and contempt. He'd issued the quo warranto inquiries, legal probes designed to challenge the very foundations of their authority, to strip them of their rights and privileges. It was a deliberate act of constriction, a way to keep the barons in check and consolidate royal power. Edward II, his successor, had tried a different approach, a liberal distribution of titles, showering favored courtiers with earldoms and creating a new generation of powerful men. But it was a fragile system, built on personal loyalty and prone to collapse. Gaveston, Andrew Harclay, Hugh Despenser, names that echoed with scandal and ultimately, with death. Only Norfolk, a surprisingly pragmatic and capable nobleman, managed to survive the purge. John of Eltham, a brilliant and ambitious man, met his end in Scotland, a casualty of political intrigue. Edward III, however, had a different philosophy. He believed in a community of interest between the king and his subjects, a notion that sounded remarkably idealistic, especially given the turbulent history of the Plantagenet dynasty. At a parliament in March 1337, he laid it out plainly. Through a due distribution of positions, dignities, and offices, it is buttressed by wise counsels and fortified by mighty powers. The kingdom, he argued, had suffered a serious decline in names, honors, and ranks of dignity. He wasn't just talking about a few extra titles. He was talking about rebuilding the very fabric of the aristocracy, creating a new generation of nobles who would be loyal, powerful, and, most importantly, useful. And he wasn't shy about rewarding those who had served him well. William Montagu, the leader of the 1330 coup, a daring, almost reckless act that had brought Edward to power, was elevated to the earldom of Salisbury. Robert Ufford became Earl of Suffolk, a title that once belonged to Scottish kings, a pointed reminder of Edward's ambitions. William Clinton received the earldom of Huntingdon, and the scions of England's great families, Henry of Grosmont, William Bohun, Hugh Audley, were granted titles that reflected their status. And then there was Edward of Woodstock, the future Black Prince, a healthy 6-year-old with a destiny far grander than most could imagine. He was made Duke of Cornwall, a title that carried a weighty historical significance, a symbolic assertion of England's claim to the French crown. The celebrations were lavish, almost obscene in their extravagance. Hundreds of pounds were spent on food and entertainment, a feast of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and endless goblets of wine. 20 knights were created, each a symbol of royal power and military might. Edward and Philippa, his queen, held separate courts, indulging in displays of wealth and luxury. It wasn't a fit of idle generosity, it was a strategic investment. Edward needed men with resources, men with households, men who would be willing to fight for him, for England. But the shadow of war loomed large. Scotland was a constant thorn in England's side, a volatile neighbor always threatening to erupt into open conflict. And then there was France. The terms and the stakes had escalated dramatically. The personalities on both sides were the most intractable, aggressive, and well-matched since Richard I had clashed with Philip Augustus. The Plantagenet world was teetering on the brink of a conflict that would span generations. Let's rewind to January 26, 1340. Ghent, a bustling Flemish city, was preparing for a royal arrival. A huge ceremony was planned, the market square adorned with banners displaying Edward's coat of arms. But this wasn't the familiar heraldry of the past. The leopards, the symbols of English sovereignty, were quartered with the ancient arms of the French crown, golden fleurs de lis, against a blue field. The fleurs de lis, once relegated to the corners of the shield, now occupied prime position, a blatant declaration of Edward's claim to the French throne. Edward stepped onto the stage, flanked by his court and the magistrates of Ghent. He raised his voice, demanding recognition as the king not just of England, but of France. He took homage from the assembled Flemish citizens, including Guy of Flanders, half-brother of the Count. He reassured them that he would respect their liberties and protect their mercantile rights. Then, as if to punctuate his claim, he ordered a jousting contest, a spectacle of chivalry and skill, a demonstration of royal power. This wasn't just a celebration, it was a calculated move, a bold assertion of Edward's dynastic ambitions. He was staking his entire claim to the French throne on this single event. The air crackled with tension, with the unspoken threat of war. The roots of this conflict stretched back centuries, tangled in the complex web of Plantagenet history and the politics of the 14th century. The traditional point of contention between the English and French kings was the English kings' status as Dukes of Aquitaine, a territory that had been a source of friction since 1259, when Henry III had agreed to homage to Louis IX, abandoning England's claims to Normandy and other territories. Throughout the 14th century, English and French interests clashed repeatedly across northwestern Europe. The French crown under Philip VI was determined to expand its borders and assert its political power, a move that directly threatened English interests in the Low Countries in Scotland and over control of shipping routes and trade in the Channel. But beneath these immediate grievances lay a deeper, more fundamental shift in the status of the two crowns. The death of Charles IV in 1328 and the accession of Philip VI had thrown France into a period of dynastic uncertainty. Edward's visit to Amiens to pay homage for his continental possessions had suggested acceptance of Philip's claim and the principle that succession followed Salic law. Yet by the time Mortimer and Isabella were removed from power, Philip was firmly established as King of France. The war with France was not simply a matter of territorial disputes or dynastic ambitions. It was a struggle for identity, for legitimacy, for the very soul of the Plantagenet dynasty. Edward's harboring of Robert of Artois, an aging fugitive from French justice, was a deliberate provocation, a way to ignite the flames of conflict. The Flemish propaganda poem, The Vows of the Heron, painted Edward as a cowardly, licentious aggressor, a caricature designed to rally support against him. But the poem also revealed the truth, that Edward's actions were driven by a deep-seated belief in his rightful claim to the French throne. The final spark that ignited the powder keg was the French demand for Robert of Artois' extradition. Edward's refusal, coupled with his support for the exiled nobleman, provided Philip with the casus belli he needed to declare war. On June 24, 1340, the English fleet led by the mighty Cog Thomas engaged the French fleet at Sluys. It was a brutal, chaotic battle, a clash of ships and men that would decide the fate of England and France. Edward, wounded in the leg, watched from the deck of his flagship as his forces decimated the French fleet, capturing or destroying over 200 ships. It was a stunning victory, a testament to English naval prowess and Edward's strategic brilliance. But the victory at Sluys was merely the beginning. The 100 Years' War had begun, a conflict that would engulf Europe for generations to come. It was a war fueled by ambition, by rivalry, and by a deep-seated belief in the rightful claim of the Plantagenet dynasty to the throne of France. Was it a gamble, a reckless act of hubris? Or was it simply the inevitable consequence of a long and troubled history? Edward III, a king born into a world of conflict and intrigue, had chosen his path, a path that would lead England and France into a century of bloodshed and devastation. And as he stood on the deck of his flagship, watching the wreckage of the French fleet drift beneath the waves, one question lingered in the air. Could a crown truly be won through force, or was it destined to be forever stained with the blood of kings?